So, if you read the article, you might find some of the things that effective altruists are very concerned about more than a little odd, right? Especially the sort of long termist wing of this movement that McCaskill represents. And if you do find this odd, then I think it's a problem for utilitarianism generally, because these guys are applying utilitarianism in a fairly principled and consistent way. Um, Now, this might not be the only way, and these guys might have some problems. They might lack a sort of certain necessary humility. In fact, I think they do. But, if you really get these weird answers, these bizarre answers that what we should be worried about in the present is sacrificing so we can have this glorious future where disembodied consciousnesses are run on computers and space stations. This is actually what Nick Bostrom believes, by the way. Um, if you think that's your main concern, that might seem odd to you. And for lack of a better term, effective altruism might seem a bit culty, right? If I told you this outside context, what Nick Bostrom believes, you'd be like, okay, that's a weird cult, man. Don't get involved with those guys. So, how do we come to these conclusions? We go from Peter Singer's way of working at utilitarianism, which is very demanding, but it seems very grounded, right? You know, what we should do is give away practical of our money to help people half a world away. Well, to me, that seems like really demanding. I don't know that we're required to do that. I hope we aren't, because, I have this very much self interested reason if I don't want to give away all my stuff, you know. But as weird as it might seem, as demanding as it might seem, that seems admirable. It seems a position worth taking seriously. Bostrom just seems bizarre and honestly kind of laughable, right? It's like, okay, you have read too much bad sci-fi. I say this as a person who reads a lot of sci-fi. I hope good sci-fi, you know. And it's like, you should maybe be writing sci-fi and not, telling us how to live our lives. But how do we get here if you find this bizarre? And how is this a consistent application of utilitarian philosophy? I think we need to go back and take another look at something we already looked at. Something I kind of, skated over a little bit because of, I wanted to get some other stuff out. And that's, how does utilitarianism deal with the fact that the consequences of most choices, especially important choices, are uncertain? And I said, well, utilitarianism plays the odds. Well, but in a lot of cases, that's a bit hand wavy, right? You know, let's say that there's a 1 in 10 chance of something really bad happening, and you could pay a certain amount of money or effort to prevent it. How much should you spend? Or 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, right? And even if things are pretty unlikely, we should probably take some effort to keep them from happening if they're really bad, right? It is really, think of ordinary life. It is really unlikely that my house is going to burn down. How many house fires do you see in a week? I mean, in my neighborhood, I've lived here 6 years now. I have not seen one on the block. House fires are rare, right? Nonetheless, house fires are so bad that if you have a house, you are going to get insurance, even though they're really unlikely, right? What is a sensible amount to pay for insurance? If you're a utilitarian, what is a sensible amount to pay to prevent these unlikely but terrible events? Killer robots, nuclear war, plagues, things like that. How do we figure it out, right? If we're buying insurance, we're just like, we probably look at the market prices. We're like, okay, what does Nationwide want? What does Geico want? We probably spitball it, but, for a lot of these events like robot apocalypse, there's no real market. There's not like Geico's robot apocalypse insurance. versus Allstate's robot apocalypse insurance, we have to figure on our own how much of our resources to devote to this. Well, the easiest way to see how utilitarians do this is to take a little detour and talk about gambling. So if I gave you these two games, what should you pay for them? What is the max amount you should pay to play these games? Flip a coin. If it's heads, you get $10. If it's tails, you get nothing. I roll a die. Die is singular of dice. And yeah, I should specify here a standard 6-sided die, right? I do know there are 4-sided die, there are 8-sided dice, there are 10-sided dice, there are 20-sided dice. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger. You use a lot of these other weird kinds of dice. When I use dice as an example, my students there's always somebody who's like, well, there's 4-sided dice, and I'm like, yes. Anyway, this is a 6-sided die. You roll it. If you get a 6, you get $300. If you get any other number, you get nothing. What is the maximum amount you should pay to play these games? Maximum amount you should pay, let me specify, if you don't want to lose money. Maybe you just like to gamble and it's fun, even if it's a bad bet, you do it, but let's assume not. What's the maximum amount somebody could charge and this still be a quote-unquote good bet? Well, the way people tend to figure this out is in terms of so-called expected value. And the math is actually really simple, right? You don't need to do calculus or, even trigonometry. It's just basic middle school, maybe even elementary school, like dividing by or multiplying by fractions, right? You take the payout times the odds you will get that payout. What are the odds you get the payout on the one? Roughly 50-50, right? Every time I do this, I'll have some student who'll send me this article. It's like, yeah, well, on most coins, one side is a little bit more likely, so heads will come up 50.5% of the time, tails 49.5%, or tails will come up 50.2%. And yeah, okay, I know this, right? Let's just pretend it's a perfectly fair coin, 50-50 either side. If that's the case, then $5 is the maximum you should pay. If it's more than $5, don't play. If it's less than $5, yeah, great idea. Give your guy this money, pay your money before he changes his mind. If it's exactly $5, you can take or leave it. With $300, 1/6 times 300 equals 50. $50 is the maximum you should pay. If it's 40, you should jump at it. If it's 60, don't do it. If it's 50, play. So why do we get these answers? Well, look, the thought here is if you played this game a very, very long time, we can just say almost infinitely, in the long term, the amount that you get paid per game would average out to $5 in the first one and $50 in the second one, right? You might have these weird runs of like 10 heads and 10 tails. Those do happen, especially if you do this long enough. But then, in the long term, that'd be rare. You would get very, very close. And the longer you played, the closer you would get to $5 or $50. And think of it this way, right? If you could play these games an infinitely long time, no matter if you're lucky, if you're playing $6 to play the first game, or even $5.50, you will eventually go bankrupt. If you are paying $4 and you play it infinitely long, you will eventually take all the money that the other person has. If you're paying $55, $60 for the second game in the long term because it's only paying out an average of 50, you will go bankrupt. If you're paying $45 to play eventually you will make the other guy go bankrupt because on average it's paying out $5 more per game than you're paying to play it. You have to do this long enough for this to work, but that's the idea. Well, so this reasoning that people develop, with gambling in mind, people apply to the economy, people apply to other things. Utilitarians, especially utilitarians of Bostrom, Beckstead, and McCaskill's stripe, apply it to ethical reasoning. And instead of expected value, they talk about expected utility. And it's the same basic idea. You take the expected happiness, instead of money, we're now talking about happiness or unhappiness, and you multiply it by the odds. Robot apocalypse might be really unlikely, but guys like Bostrom and Beckstead and McCaskill will say, well, it's so bad that when you multiply how bad it is, how much happiness it would cost, even by these really long odds, it's still a thing we ought to take seriously, right? In the same way, you can think of a lottery. Your odds of winning the lottery are really long, but if the money's enough, it might make sense to play. Drop $1 or $2, even though your chances are 1 in millions, right? In the same way, when you're thinking about happiness or unhappiness, you think about how big the number is, how good or bad it is if it happened. You also think about the odds. Now, this might seem sensible enough, and for a lot of decisions, I think it's it's not a terrible way to think about them, right? Is it worth buying some kind of insurance? You think about how likely the thing is versus how bad it is it would happen, right? Is it worth buying life insurance? Well, I don't think I'm going to get hit by a train tomorrow or whatever. It would be really bad if it happened for my kids, so probably worth buying life insurance, right? Is it worth buying, if you live in the city of Norfolk, is it worth buying insurance for a bear attack specifically? No. If you get mauled by a bear, that would be terrible. You'd have horrible medical bills. I don't think there are any bears in Norfolk, right? Odds times happiness. Now, this seems fairly commonsensical. The problem is that it spits back some weird answers in some cases. Think about it this way. If you are helping somebody out, it might make sense to want to help somebody out for sure, rather than gambling on something that could do a lot more good but might not. When people prefer charity close to home, this is one of the things they will say, and I don't think it should be dismissed. I could give my money to some charity that does some unproven thing half a world away that has a potential to do a lot of good, but I might prefer to just give it at, my church or a local homeless shelter or to a charity I know about, because it's more certain. I know they will help people. Maybe I don't want to gamble. But, if the odds are good enough and the payout's good enough, the utilitarian will pretty much always say you should gamble, or at least the effective altruist stripe of utilitarian. You can save, weird thought experiment, the kind philosophers like, these weird cases. You can save one life for sure, or have a 1 in 10,000 chance of saving 10,001. Well, the utilitarian would say you should do the second thing. I don't know, that seems a bit odd to me. Things get even weirder when you think about huge payouts but very long odds. Now, I think this explains how the effective altruists that we read about in the article end up in the seemingly, to me at least, bizarre places they do. The easiest way to see how this happens is to think about infinity or infinite payout. Um, there's a philosopher, Pascal, and Pascal is brilliant. I mean, just one of those, one of those guys you read about him and you're just intimidated by, oh my God, my brain doesn't work like that. You know, I read about Pascal and it's like if a dog could read about how smart a grown-up person is, right? This guy's just brilliant. I don't think like that. I can't do that, right? But Pascal, he basically invented one of the people who invented modern probability theory, brilliant mathematician. He has this argument that we should all try to talk ourselves into believing in God now. And it's interesting because if you're as brilliant as Pascal, you probably don't do much stuff that's not interesting. It also strikes most people as thoroughly ridiculous. And here's Pascal's argument. Look, Pascal, good, he lived in the 17th, I think it was the 17th century, good, fairly orthodox Catholic. He lived in France. Everybody was Catholic at that time who was religious in France. And so Pascal thought, okay, well, you have two options. You can either believe in God, which for him meant, become a good Catholic, or you can be a godless atheist. Now, if God exists and you're a godless atheist, that's not going to be good for you. If you believe in God, that's going to be great for you. You will get an infinite payout. You will go to heaven where life will be great forever and ever and ever, right? And Pascal said, look, suppose you're an agnostic in the strictest sense of the term. You don't know whether God exists, but you think there's at least some chance. Pascal says, well, no matter how unlikely you think it is God exists, even if you just think there's a 1 in a billion chance God exists, 1 in a billion chance, that there's going to be any kind of afterlife, whatever, you should nonetheless start going to church, saying prayers, try to talk yourself into believing in God. Why is that? Well, 1 in a million chance God exists and sends those who believe in him to heaven. Well, 1/1,000,000th, I forget, I'm not even going to do the math, what fraction of a percentage this is, but 1/1,000,000th multiplied by infinity is infinite. You say, well, okay, I think God's even more unlikely. I think there's only 1 in a billion chance. It says, well, look, 1,000,000,000 times infinity is still infinity. No matter how unlikely you think it is God exists, if you give it any chance, Pascal says you should believe in God. I had a student once who said he thinks there's literally zero chance. I don't know. I think most agnostics would give some chance. And if you do, Pascal says you need to believe in God. Now, the problem with Pascal's argument is that, if you think about other cases, it gives you really weird, wrong answers. And this is an example from one of my former professors, Jim Cargyle. Jim had a very weird, but also funny sense of humor. And Jim said this. He's like, well, look, imagine I'm home minding my business, and all of a sudden an angel of the Lord, or what seems to be an angel of the Lord, appears to me in all its glory and says, okay, Jim Cargyle, or okay, Sam Duncan, or fill in your own name here, God wants you to go burn down the bus station. Wants you to go set fire, burn down the Greyhound station. What should you do? The angel says, well, if you burn down the bus station as your Lord has commanded, you will go to paradise forever. If you don't, well, let's not talk about that, right? Now, as Jim points out, and Jim was a believer, he was an Episcopalian, I'm a believer, at least think it's possible God exists and he speaks to people. Nonetheless, that would not be what I would think in this case, right? I think, okay, one of two things is happening. You are having a psychotic break and you need to go see a doctor very, very soon, or somebody is playing an elaborate, good, and very, very cruel prank on you, right? But you say, it's like, okay, What do you think that the odds are that this is a legitimate angel of the Lord who wants you to burn down the Greyhound station? It's possible, right? Especially if you're like Jim and me and you actually think God exists. I'd say, okay, 1 in a million. 1 in a million. It's like, well, if there's any chance that God exists and wants you to burn down the Greyhound station and will reward you infinitely, no matter how unlikely it is, you should go fill up your gas can, get some matches, and make your way down to the Greyhound station. That is completely nuts, though, right? Tiny, tiny probability times huge reward. You can think of other ridiculous cases, and in most of them, we would think, yeah, there's some chance, but it's so small, I don't care. Pascal uses this to argue for religious belief, but if you're a good expected utility theory person, you can plug in all sorts of crazy things here and get the answer you should do it. That seems like, to my mind, a flat counterexample to utilitarian theory. And I think it, you guys might think, well, okay, our professor's going off on a huge digression, but to come back to the effective altruists, I think this explains Bostrom's, to my mind, very weird obsessions, right? You know, oh, it's unlikely, but even if you think there's just 1 in 100,000 chance that we will be able to colonize the stars in our glorious space stations and upload the consciousnesses of our descendants, think about it. There's trillions and trillions of people in glorious space station future. Multiply trillions and trillions, even for long odds, you get a big number. So you ought to be willing to sacrifice a fair amount of money to make sure we get space station future, or even make it more likely. This seems crazy to me, but it's hard to avoid. I am not a mathematician. If you ever take calculus, you run into this problem. When can you treat small numbers like they're zero and ignore them? I don't know. I don't understand all the delta epsilon waltz and dance that mathematicians do. All I remember is, well, sometimes you can treat this number like zero when you want to add or subtract, and then you can treat it like not zero when you want to divide. And I'm like, all right, fine. That's what I need to pass the class. That's all I remember. This is a big problem, what you do with these small numbers and big odds, though, if you're a utilitarian. And you can just go full on weird like Bostrom does. A lot of people don't want to. It's hard to avoid. A bigger problem than this weird theoretical possibility, though, is where do you get these numbers from? In the article, you have all these effective altruists and their little, meetings talking about credences, credence, whatever. And you might think, well, that sounds fancy. They got a number. Who am I to question? But you should. What are the odds that, robots will kill us all? What number should you plug in there? It's easy to plug in a number when you roll a die, right? 6 sides, if it's a fair die, roughly 1 time in 6, each number will come up. If it's an 8-sided die, 1 time in 8, right? It is not hard to plug those numbers in. Same with any kind of gambling, right? Fair deck of cards, I shuffle, I cut. If I shuffle well, how often am I going to draw an ace on the first draw? 4 aces, 52 cards. 1 out of every 13 cards is an ace. 1 time out of 13, that first draw will be an ace, right? Unless I'm messing my math up, which is possible. There's no good way to figure the odds for big events in the same way. If If you guys have, if you ever watch Star Wars and C-3PO is always throwing out the odds, like, what do you mean by this, robot? It's a good question, right? In the same way, when these guys talk about credences, my credence is that robots will kill us all as 1/3. It's not like Mr. Effective Altruist Boy can run a simulation in his mind. I don't know, maybe C-3PO can run a simulation in his mind where Han Solo does some dumb thing, right? It's not like EA Boy can run like a simulation of our future, a perfect simulation, and 1/3 of the time Skynet kills us all, right? Skynet's the computer from the Terminator, right? When these effective altruists talk about their credences, all they're saying is, this is my best guess at the odds. This term credence sounds really fancy. It sounds like, oh, credence, yes. Unless you're thinking of the band, right? It sounds like, okay, these guys have a number, they're smart people, whatever. Credence just means, at best, educated guess, and at worst, wild-ass guess, right? Bostrom or McCaskill's credences for robot apocalypse are pretty high, so we should be really worried about it. We should do a lot to prevent it. Duncan's, mine, are pretty much 0. Who's right? Now, this is a more general problem for utilitarians, right? You might think that the effective altruists, especially these long-termist guys, are doing a bad job with their guesses, with their credences. But where do you get a number from? If you're a utilitarian and you're using this expected utility theory to make choices, you need a number. And if you don't have one, you can't apply your formula, you can't apply your theory. But if you have one and it's wrong, you will do crazy, stupid stuff. And this is a general problem for utilitarianism. A lot of people are very impressed with utilitarianism because it has a formula, right? It looks all precise and mathy. They use a technical term, right? But a formula is useless if you cannot plug in the numbers. And especially when it comes to the odds of something happening, there is a real problem with utilitarianism plugging in the numbers in any principled way. All right, I'll wrap up here. Hopefully all this stuff about gambling and didn't confuse you guys. I don't know, usually people light up when I talk about gambling. The one guy, they'll see this in online classes, but when I'm in person, the one guy who's been ignoring me all semester is like, ooh, gambling. All right. Anyway, we'll wrap up here. For this lecture, we'll dig a bit more into this in the next one.